Right, so we're pretty much at 2 o'clock. Michael, over to you.
Thank you. Hi. Sorry if I cough part through this. I'm recovering from COVID at the moment, so still have a bit of a slight chesty cough, but apologies for that part way through. So presentation day is all about Horizon Cloud and scaling, and this kind of came out of a project that we were doing recently. So as is there, I'm Michael Young. I work as part of the North EMEA PSO team. I've been with VMware for around 3.5 or so years now, primarily working in digital workspace, so focus on Horizon on-premise, in the cloud, and all of its associated byproducts such as app volumes and DEM and things like that, Workspace One Access. So we'll be talking about scaling Horizon Cloud for this particular topic. I've put a small agenda together, really covering off, excuse me, things around what the customer requirements were and how we needed to go about thinking of a scaling approach. So what were the elements we needed to consider? So I've kind of listed those out here in terms of the subscription resource groups, IP addressing, so on and so forth. You can ask questions during the presentation, but I've allowed a little bit of time at the end to go through some Q&A should you have any questions or want to delve deeper into certain aspects. So without any further ado, so what the customer was looking to achieve with Horizon Cloud was initially just to replicate their application testing for the user base they have, and this was needed to be done virtually. So originally we didn't need to think about scaling, it was only 200 users or so, but what we then quickly understood is they want to expand this requirement to encompass their standard Office users. And they went, oh yeah, by the way, we kind of like what you're doing, but can we now add 25,000 users to this piece of work? And we went, yeah, that's great, we can do that. But this then let us sit back and kind of consider, well, how are we going to best approach this design? Because we're going beyond our normal constraints, if you like, in terms of a delivery, because there's not many implementations we've done where we go beyond the 2,000 kind of level for the Horizon Cloud at present. So that kind of led us into a scaling approach. How are we going to look at this? So we went and asked them some rudimentary high-level requirements that we thought we needed to determine within inside the approach to scaling this to work with inside Horizon Cloud. And once we had those rudimentary requirements, it kind of led us to break it down into 5 key points, if you like. So as I mentioned, the 2,000 VMs per or sessions per subscription. Now that's not really a restriction per se from VMware. This is more of an API limit in terms of how it can only support 2,000 VMs in the subscription or 2,000 sessions, purely because of the way that the code talks back into the cloud, and you've got to wait for things to happen. So it's kind of limited to that level of 2,000. Next iteration, we should be able to go a bit further than that, but that's something to come in the future. Now, VNet and subscription creation. You do really need to think about these. If you're going for a very easy standard deployment, okay, we're going to do a POC, then you don't need to tend to worry about it because it will deploy it for you as you deploy out Horizon Cloud on Azure. But I would say it's more advisable to sit back and do that VNet and subnet creation yourself. It's a lot more control, saves you going back and doing a bit of work later. At the time we were doing this, we were unable to expand pods and subnets. So again, it's another reason why we need to think about our VNet and subnet creation. And it's purely to do with the fact that when we brought out the manifest 2298, we were able then to add additional VNets and subnets that we could then peer, that you could present back into the Horizon Cloud environment. Again, it is kind of a band-aid approach to something you haven't probably configured properly at the beginning. So I would always think of it as you can't expand pods and subnets and think about creating it correctly in the first place. And then when you've got a multi-pod environment, you can't reuse names. So again, leads to scaling approach. How's that going to affect in terms of naming? Because it's kind of a flat file structure, the things you need to think about in terms of what you can't name are things like images, farms, VDI desktop assignments, things like that. So again, excellent time for thought about planning and naming. And then the final piece, which doesn't always ring true with everybody, is around security. So we have the option where for UAGs for external access, we can deploy them into a separate VNet. However, this customer wants to go one step further and use a subscription as that security boundary to allow another layer of complexity into the environment and segregation as well. And you can go into another piece around NSGs on top of the VNets and stuff like that, but that's a subject probably for another day in terms of creating security. So hence, those were our kind of 5 areas that we needed to think about to put this design together. So we thought about, well, how are we going to plan to build this thing out? We need to think about what it's going to look like and how we're going to manage it. So our first point of call was management groups. Now, you don't necessarily need these, especially if it's a smaller environment. It's kind of, these are to really segregate administrative privileges at the higher level. So another requirement that we had to consider when we did this implementation was we needed Azure Active Directory domain services, purely because we didn't have access to the on-premise domain services. That wasn't going to be able to come later. So we built this environment with AADDS and then siloed that off so that we could create the relevant security groups for that side. And then we have our Horizon pod management. So the Horizon admins could manage everything below that. Then we needed to think about subscriptions. This is used to meet the customer requirement for the current sizing limit. So subscription, 2,000 VMs or sessions per subscription. So that set out how many subscriptions we're going to need to require to meet the number of use cases to be delivered. And then obviously we then need resource groups, and these are obviously the containers to contain the relevant VMs for that piece of work. And as you can see there, hopefully we've got, multi-pod sessions, UAGs, things like that, how we're going to segregate those out. So it kind of then splits out the planning an awful lot easier for you once you have that element set by. And the next thing you need to think about is whether you need to take into account tenants, because they will also bring in another level of planning that you need. So the diagram that I've got here is kind of a very small subset of what we went to look to deploy in the customer's environment. So we started off with a production tenant. We also needed to have an application tenant. We also needed to provide a testing tenant and a pre-prod tenant, and so on and so forth. And we had to think about how we're going to name this structure. The first element is obviously the tenant. Very simple. We've got production, we've got test, we've got pre-prod, we've got application. So naming was fairly simple for that bit. It kind of got a little bit more difficult when we came to the subscriptions. So we kind of came up with this naming convention to abbreviate kind of where you were at, where you're looking to work within, and the elements that were going to be deployed within inside each of those areas. So the same with the resource group and the VNets and the subnets. We kind of thought about this naming pattern so that we could replicate each of these independently across each of the different tenants, and each tenant would have a name pattern fairly similar, and they would replicate against what that tenant was it was sitting in. So as you can see here, the main considerations are for if you're running up a desktop pool, you need 2 subnets, and when you're running up a UAG pool, you need 3 subnets, and it's purely because of the way that the Horizon Cloud is deployed into the platform. So we wanted to make this, again, the next step was a kind of like determining an IP addressing approach, because we didn't want the customer just to ram in different IP addresses here, there, and everywhere, and us trying to work out, okay, well, that subnet range can fit in here and that subnet range can fit in there. So our plan was to take a single CIDR range within the environment, a /20, and then subdivide that out. So what that looked like is what we have here. Our /20 were then divided into 4 /22s, which we then cut across planes, Horizon Cloud control planes, to deliver the number of IP addresses that we required to then meet the customer's deliverable. So this should give us the scope to build up to our 25,000 users that we needed to deliver with inside the customer's environment. And then finally, we can't forget that we need to peer a lot of these VNets together, because we've created all of this manually. No traffic will flow between any other VNet without you actually setting up any peer groups. So you need to understand what parts of the design need to speak to other parts of the design. So in this instance, all of our desktop pools or VNets need to speak to our core ADDS environment, purely because that's where all of the pod managers are and other relevant elements of the design, such as Azure file stores for DEM and things like that. And then finally, we needed to add in the layer where our UAGs are able to communicate back to the relevant desktop pool to allow a user to get access to assigned environments, be that virtual desktop, RDS or WVD type session. There's a lot more VNet pairing involved in it than this, but this is kind of a simplified flow just to show you that you need to consider these elements too. And this can get quite complex depending on who needs to talk to what and where. But that kind of gives you the basics to start with. And we then needed to kind of provide resiliency into the environment. And this is where we took our cloud control planes and then split out the environment. So initially we had UK South to deploy into, but they wanted the option to be able to still facilitate user access in the event that UK South was unavailable. So we then brought in UK West and then split out the environment associated in exactly the same manner as UK South. So you can see here from pod A and pod C, we have slightly less IP addresses that we can use or users that we can present, purely because we're having to factor in all of the management elements as well. Whereas obviously when you look at pod B and D, we have the full range of 8,000 IP addresses or users that we can assign. So when you add all those together, we can provision around 28,000 plus usable IP addresses for the environment. Because we're talking WVD here, we don't necessarily need a full 28,000 IP addresses, because obviously we're looking at provisioning instances that users go onto. But essentially what we're showing here is that, be that WVD or a standard Windows 10 VDI VM, we can still accommodate that number of users. So what we then needed to think about is how we're going to take the expandability of this beyond where we're at. So initially, obviously, it was around, as I say, 2,000 users. So this is where we kind of use the control plane to meet the expandability. So as we needed additional capacity, we just add another pod to the control plane. And this gave the customer great flexibility, including the option at a later date to include some on-premise environments that they had. So they can bring those in and still allow access via this mechanism for users to access desktops, be they in the cloud or on-premise. It gave them quite a unique use case that they hadn't really considered before. But that kind of brought a big question around from them. It was like, well, how are they all going to access this? Because at the moment, they're talking to different FQDNs, different access methods. We need lots of other technology involved. So, excuse me, we talked about the universal broker. And the advantages that this brings is the single FQDN access for them. So we have this element within inside the universal broker that allows us to integrate all of the pods together through one access URL. So what this does really is eliminate the need for cloud pod architecture within inside an environment. And also, in addition, when you bring in the universal broker, because you're removing cloud pod architecture, you're reducing the need for east-west traffic, because essentially what this is doing is providing the user with a single FQDN. It then looks at all of its assignments across every pod that it can see, and then picks the one that it thinks is the closest to that user, and then presents that desktop out. So we're removing the requirement for global server load balancing. We're also introducing a more optimal performance connection to the desktop for the user. And because, excuse me, because the universal broker uses resources from the assignments, it's only really looking at assignments within there and not looking at individual pods as such. So it just looks at the assignment, where are those assignments associated to, and then delivers you the desktop that's credited to that. One limitation here is that you can only have 5 groups to a single user. Generally not too much of an issue, but it depends how big your environment gets to, because obviously you need to consider that when you're deploying the assignments, that you set them up correctly, so that no matter where you have a failure, the user is always able to get a desktop delivered to them in the event of that failure occurring. So that's the only kind of small caveat to that. That's the 5 assignment group limit. Oh, well, we also needed to include Workspace One Access into this, purely because they wanted to deliver the entitlements via the Workspace One hub catalog. So what we did was also include the Workspace One Access connector into the core element of their subscription. Again, trying to give them that single user activity, single user FQDN, so that you've got one place to go, but giving them added benefit around essentially adding policies that can be added to authentication mechanisms, so we can add layers of conditional policies to how a user gets in. So depending on where they are, what access device they're connecting from, we were able to deliver a more secure access point as opposed to just going through the universal broker, because Workspace One Access kind of integrates with the universal broker. So you sit that above the top of the universal broker, the user authenticated, he then gets the connectivity to the universal broker. He then goes and looks at all the assignments you have, and then represents up to you the entitlements that you're then available to, and then wraps over the security over the top of that. So they were really happy with this because it gave them a single pane of glass, if you like, from where to start from. So essentially, this was what is a cut down version of what we eventually presented to the customer. So as you can see here, we have that Workspace One layer in at the top that presents the URL to the customer or to the end user. They then go pass through to the Horizon Cloud, which then looks at where they're going. It kind of looks at their entitlement and then presents down, as you can see here on the right, the relevant pod that they need to get access to present out the desktop. And then you can see in the on-premise section is where we're eventually going to be adding in connectivity to their on-premise AD, so we can do proper or do a full authentication against their existing AD accounts later on in the future, once that connectivity is in place. So in conclusion, what we ended up doing was, so we could get the scale that they wanted, we needed to think about the provisioning ahead to meet the demands that that customer required in terms of scaling not just to the initial 25,000, but eventually to the 125,000. And providing the ability to do that was to look at the delivery mechanism in terms of how we build out Horizon in the cloud. So it's more around the Azure development for that than the Horizon Cloud, because that part's fairly simple. You just have to think about, okay, tenant, subscription, resource group, VNet, subnet, and once you've got that in, there's your ability to scale. So the customer's exceptionally happy with that work that we did around their Azure piece, which they didn't really take into account. And then finally, high availability, wrapping in the universal broker and a Workspace One Access gave us that fundamental building platform to present out to the customer the fact that we can make this highly available using our multi-cloud assignments. Doesn't matter where your user accesses the environment from, they will always get access to a desktop or a session, and that will be delivered in a more performant manner. And the universal broker will try and find the closest assignment to that geographical location that the user is sitting in to give the most performant access that they need. And then finally, the 25K and beyond, we express to them how, when they implement their IP address ranges, to look at using CIDR ranges as the starting point for the Horizon Cloud deployment. so that if they need to scale beyond the 25,000, each 25,000, in this case, obviously we can demonstrate 28,000, but for each 25, in essence, you take another IP CIDR range, and that will give you the scale to go to 25, 50, 75, 100, and so on and so forth. And we can then wrap all those back in through the Universal Broker and Workspace One Access to continually deliver that single FQDN, no matter how large you want to grow this environment. And finally, what I've done is I've put some key reference points in here to really direct you to where you need to have a look at in terms of why you would have a 2000 VM limit, why we don't expand subnets, multi-cloud assignments, how you use them, how best to set them up, what are the limitations when you do that, and how you can get around them. But the real core one here is the Microsoft Azure requirements checklist. Now, if you start with that and you work your way from the top to the bottom, you should never really get yourself into a position where essentially you've got to take everything that you've done, destroy it, and start again. Because believe me, I've been there, I've done it, or I haven't really followed the checklist. I've got it halfway through and gone, that doesn't work. And in Azure, you can't just change things. You have to take it out and put it back in again, which is an awful lot of work. So always best to go through that element first before you do on anything else. And finally, perhaps a key one here that not many people are aware about, but the Azure firewall doesn't really support persistence because it's how is it built? I can't remember the exact reason why it can't do it. Something to do with the way that it's split across the Azure infrastructure. It can't give you, for UAG this is anyway, if you're running the UAGs externally to get access, it never really forwards the originating IP header. So when the UAG receives the response coming in, it only gets the Azure firewall IP address. And therefore, if anyone's done UAG work before, you need the two protocol channels to be going through the same UAG. It's not able to do that because it doesn't get that originating IP address. So it can't determine who you were originally. It thinks everybody is the Azure firewall. So you need to think about looking at either using Azure Front Door or the application gateway. So you can use X-forwarded headers that will present out that originating source IP address and then deliver the user to the correct UAG each time to keep that path alive. And with that, I'm at the end. So open to any questions.
Michael, I'm going to ask you one. Sorry if I missed it at the beginning when I ran and grabbed a drink, but what about image management and consistent images across regions, or dare I say even data centers? You know, you might want to keep an image consistent across on-prem and Azure. Do you see any challenges there?
You can, well, obviously we can use the Microsoft Marketplace for images, and that's where we recommend most people start, because the images that are presented through there for Horizon have already got the relevant DAS agents within them and its optimized image. You can also bring in your own image, but you do have to do an awful lot more work around getting that optimized and the right DAS agents in the correct order and then publishing it out. So you can do one and the same, replicating the images between on-prem and cloud. I don't think we have that functionality in place just yet. I've been doing some reading on it recently and it's coming, but it's not quite there yet. So you couldn't take your on-premise image and without a bit of work, put it up into the cloud and then replicate it between everywhere. But you can definitely do that for marketplace images for sure.
Sorry, I can just imagine one of my customers asking me that exact question, going, well, I still press my images in this way. How does that translate?
Yeah, you can't really press them in the same way. Our VMware's recommended approach is you take the marketplace image and then you modify that one, because we've done all the work with the agents and everything else already. We do have a process for bringing in your own image, but you have to kind of break it to then re-add it and then optimize it. And the optimization is the key part here. You can't just run the Fling optimization or the productize optimization, because the one we do in the cloud, it runs slightly differently to the on-premise version. So again, it's kind of, yes, you can, but you've got to be very careful when bringing in your own images.
That's cool. Well, thank you. Sorry, but otherwise, absolutely awesome presentation. Really good.
Thank you. Any questions?
How often do you, I know you had some mention there of subscription limits, etc. within Azure. I mean, have you ever run into occasions where you're rate limited by the APIs, not because you've overburdened individual subscriptions, but by just the general Azure variance in what they're supporting?
I haven't personally, no. I have run into issues when we do, in particular with this customer as well, we needed to create some Postman scripts to fire against the Azure environment, because we needed to be able to delete some permanently created virtual machines once they'd been finished. And there we did meet this kind of limit in terms of what we could actually do and achieve in a timely fashion. So not through the actual deployment scenario and delivering a desktop infrastructure, but definitely like day two operational wise, I've met some challenges with the API environment. It runs a bit slow. So we had to work with the Horizon Cloud engineering team, and they rewrote some of the APIs to improve the performance. So, I mean, we've done a lot of work with the engineering team off the back of this project to help improve some of the API flow, which is why in the next iteration of Horizon Cloud, you'll find that there'll be a huge improvement over what you can deploy, the sizing of it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen similar with another vendor's product, shall we say, running against Azure, but certainly at some points, because of some bizarre behavior in that tool, we were running into API rate limits back from the Azure API.
Yeah, it's a kind of point and pray. You let it go, and then you just have to wait. Unfortunately, and there's no progress bar to tell you how far it's got or what it's doing. So it can get frustrating.
Cool. I mean, do you do much with Azure Policy? Do you integrate at all with Azure Policy for DSC and things like that on the machines you stand up here?
Are you talking what, WDATTP or whatever, the Windows Defender stuff, or? Well,
so I mean, if you're in an Azure tenant and you do, typically you would use Azure, well, certainly for our server workloads, you use Azure Policy and desired state config, and you can extend that obviously to desktop platforms as well. I mean, do you see, rather than relying on traditional kind of GPO type management?
Yeah, because at the moment, so for this particular customer, to get around that issue, rather than using the policies you're talking about, we actually implemented Workspace One UEM, and then for their virtual desktops, because it needed to be of a specific security stance. So we use Workspace UEM to apply all of that configuration and policy settings for a set stance on the build, and not rely on group policy objects whatsoever. Slightly different for the WVD environment, because we can't manage that via Workspace One UEM at the moment. We did then have to revert back to GPO policy driven approach, because as yet we don't have full support for Azure AD, just pure Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. We only have the user side support and not the machine side support. But then that brings its own challenges, because we don't have any group policy objects or OUs to deploy into. So you've got to think about starting to use those policy-based driven wizards, and we don't have anything in the horizon at the moment that looks at doing it in that manner. So something we've taken away to look at what we can do to automate that.
I mean, do you see many customers kind of trying to complement this with Intune or solutions like that as well? I mean, because to me, the VMware Environment Manager stuff, it seemed more kind of profile driven, whereas the stuff you would push in with Intune might be more kind of system configuration driven.
Well, that's where we use UEM, but obviously we're at impasse at the moment where it doesn't support non-persistent environments. Again, we were working with the UEM team to see if we can bring that in line with the Horizon Cloud, and the non-persistent approach, because it's just not a supported platform variant at the moment. So again, I haven't done much work with customers in Intune. I know they are using it. I know the customer we were working with was using Intune, but they wanted us to do the conditional access policy via Workspace One Access for authentication and access to the entitlements for the desktops and WVD sessions. But Intune was definitely in place for other elements of the environment.
Yeah, I mean, Intune's been tricky in my experience, because Microsoft has basically rebuilt Intune over the last couple of years whilst it's driving down the road, which has introduced its own challenges for things. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Cool. So, I mean, that brings us to time for that session. So thanks very much, Michael. That was really interesting. So we've got a 5-minute break to do a kind of changeover. I don't know if we've got Brian on yet for your Kubernetes topic.
I am here.
Cool. Okay. So if you want to get your deck queued up, as I say, we've got a couple of minutes before we kick off. So if anybody has any questions, hang on for Michael, or for general questions, we'd say got a couple of minutes.